these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Back by popular demand. Today we have with us Scott Adams. You remember Scott? He was on a few months back. He is the creator of the Dilbert cartoons. That's probably what he's most known for, but he's also an author, outspoken, logical thinker, and really has his own podcast, a great Twitter account. I'd recommend you follow it. Scott, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So just so people know, what is your podcast called?
Well, I call it Coffee with Scott Adams. If you Google that, it'll pop up.
Google Scott Adams, you will find it. And again, you're on Twitter at Scott Adams Says, I believe.
That's right.
And, last time you were on, we talked a lot about persuasion, how to hypnotize somebody. You tried to convince me that we were in a matrix of some sorts. I'm still not totally persuaded, but really interesting conversation. And so you're back by popular demand. That was one of our more popular episodes at the time. So again, appreciate it. Let's just start with what's going on in your personal life, Scott. You're living in California at the moment, right? So you're in Northern California, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm outside of San Francisco in the East Bay.
Yeah.
And when I look out my window, it's nothing but smoke. And so I've been inside for a few weeks. I can't drive anywhere because there's no place to drive to. So I'm pretty much on house arrest, and it looks like no end in sight.
Yeah, it's concerning. The narratives surrounding wildfires are, of course, contentious because it's not like we can possibly agree on a simple set of facts in America at this point in time. You've been talking about that a lot. I've seen you retweeted by friend Michael Schellenberger quite a bit. And it's got to be frustrating. And so I'd like you to comment on that and also relate it to your book, Loserthink. Now, it's kind of a sort of comical title, but it's a pretty serious book. I'm almost all the way through it. And if I would have to describe the theme of the book, it's basically how the ways that we think illogically and emotionally and perhaps how to correct those logical fallacies and how not to think like losers, I guess, as you would put it. So, but it seems that we see a lot of that lately. I mean, is that what we're seeing with the wildfire debate?
Yeah, the bigger concept in Loserthink is that if you have a good talent stack, in other words, if you've been exposed to the different ways that people understand the world, let's say you'd studied economics, as I have. Let's say you'd studied psychology, history, and the things that are useful for understanding your world, you can have a better chance of getting it right. Now, if you look at the forest fires, the people who had a certain amount of knowledge said, politicians are telling us it's climate change. That's probably right. But if you have, as you mentioned, the Michael Schellenberger level of information, you go down a little bit deeper and suddenly you're talking to people who know forest management. And they say, no, this would have happened and it was completely predictable no matter what because of the way the forests were mismanaged. And in fact, you look at the forest fires from a satellite picture, and you see that the forest fires stop burning. That they start at the bottom of the state, they go all the way up to the top of the United States, and they stop at the Canadian border. Now, is there no climate change on the other side of the Canadian border? Does it just stop in America? Probably there's something about the way things are managed that's important here. But are we smart enough to know? And the answer is no. We can't really sort out, is there a climate change component? If there is, how big is it? But we can say with some certainty that we would have gotten something very much like this with or without climate change.
Yeah, there's a lack of humility in assessing what's going on in the world around us. And I don't know if that's always been the case. I mean, I've only been alive 36 years, so that's pretty much my experience. And it does seem like it has gotten worse. Whereas maybe earlier on in my life, when I was in college, I went to a very liberal school, but prestigious school, I guess, at Tufts. And I don't recall politics being so in your face. I don't recall people knowing things with such 100% confidence the way they do now. And I wonder, do you think social media has changed that? Has it removed any sense of humility, or are people are people wired to believe that there's a single simple answer for the world around them?
Well, people are simply wired to take sides with their team and then double down, even if the evidence says they're wrong. There's science that shows that if you're proven wrong, you'll double down. So you can't really even talk people out of ridiculous thoughts. But I was speculating this morning on my own Periscope that the AI has effectively already taken over. And here's the argument for that. AI is what's determining what news and what social media gets surfaced, and therefore what we look at and care about. And the AI is just sort of mindlessly poking around to find what gets the most clicks. Now, it turns out that what gets the most clicks, of course, is anything that gets you excited, anything that's provocative. So AI guarantees that the news will tend toward the provocative. And if we all get worked up, then the news is all worked up, and then the government sort of has to follow. Because it would be really tough in your job to do something that, let's say, 80% of the public was opposed to. You could, it's possible, but in a real world, it doesn't happen. So I would argue that we're already at the point where AI is determining our outcomes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because I actually noted that tweet. You were tweeting in response to the protests, and I want to get to that here in a second. But first, I just want to sort of expand on this point that you're making, and it's difficult from a political perspective. So, to me, it's a form of populism to basically tell the public what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear. I mean, it's a total lack of leadership. It's reflecting the emotions of the public. And I think we've seen that in the coronavirus. I think we've seen it in forest fires. I think we see it in the protests, as you mentioned. So responsible leaders would say, hey, hold on, guys, like this isn't true. I realize it spread like wildfire, so to speak, on social media, whether it's claiming that climate change is responsible for wildfires, or whether it's claiming that cops are hunting minorities down, any of these untruths, or whether it's the claims about coronavirus, all of these untruths that spread like crazy. One reason being, as you put it, the incentives of social media and clickbait and the financial incentives associated with that. But it's up to leaders to actually say, no, stop. This simply isn't true. And instead we see more populist tendencies from leaders. But is it the leaders' fault or is it the people's fault? And I think that's the question, or is it simply both, and we all have to collectively do better?
Well, it's definitely both. I've been doing this experiment with my craziest Democrat friend, who has the advantage of also being Ivy League educated, really smart guy who follows the news. And so you would think, how hard would it be to simply present him with good sources and say, here, you were mistaken about this. Here's a source that will correct it. And I've been doing that with a number of things. He's believed just about every hoax that comes out of CNN, from the hoax that the president once noodled about drinking bleach to cure the coronavirus. He believed that actually happened. And yeah. if I show him the news report about UV light that was being experimented on at that time when the president mentioned it, for inserting it by a trachea kind of a device that they stick down the trachea. So he actually was talking about something that was real. So I show my friend the actual science, a real company doing a real test, injecting a disinfectant in the form of light, show him that the president was speaking about light, because it's in the quote. You can very clearly see that it wasn't about some kind of household disinfectant. The whole context was about light, and there's the science, and it's real. Now, if you think that therefore my friend says, oh, wow, I got that completely wrong. I think I will now modify my belief with this new information. Doesn't happen. Instead, he slightly changed the subject to something else. And I know from experience, because I've been talking to him for a few years, that a month from now, he won't remember that happened. And he will say once again that the president suggested drinking bleach. And I'll have to start over and say, okay, let me find the email I sent you. And that is actually common. So if you say to yourself, well, there's something wrong with your friend, I would say, nope, that's not the problem here. There's something wrong with people. It's our most basic characteristic that we will believe just about anything if it agrees with our team and it's what we want to believe.
Yeah, and I write about that same subject, from different perspectives, and I try to catch myself doing it as well. We try to be self-aware of doing the same thing, but you know, I think a classic voter and independent would probably say, it's both sides. Both sides do it, and to an extent that's true. But I think that the left is much more powerful in perpetuating some of these false narratives and then sticking to them. I mean, sticking to their guns like no other. So I just try not to take sides with opinions on the right that I just know are not defensible, and so that I avoid having to correct myself. Because it is devastating to your psychological state to have to correct yourself. So, I mean, I get it. We all feel it when you're wrong.
My observation is that while both sides, the left and the right, will do some hyperbole, they'll shade the truth, they'll fail the fact checking, that the group that is out of power, meaning they don't have their president in power, is worse. So if you go back to the Obama time, I think the right was a little bit more guilty of shading the truth. And if you look at today with Trump, it's definitely the left is going nuts. Now, part of the reason for that is just obvious, which is if your president is in power, you almost always have some accomplishments you could talk about. So you can talk about real things. But if you're the criticizing side, you kind of have to make stuff up to make your case. And so people get a little carried away with that. But then on top of that, I would argue that the right does a little bit better job of defining what's opinion and what is news. Everybody knows Sean Hannity is opinion, but what's Jake Tapper? Is he news? Is he news? Is he opinion? And I don't think that CNN does a good job of delineating that. So people watch Jake Tapper and they say, well, that was the news. I just learned something. And they may have been a little bit more guarded if they knew it was an opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. They also own the institutions of academia, and college students are much more likely to trust the source coming from their professors. And this is increasingly alarming to a lot of conservatives. I mean, I get so many examples from parents, and I've started to believe that maybe I should try and figure out a way to highlight these examples of highly illiberal. So anti-liberal thinking, anti-enlightenment thinking being perpetuated in our schools, like advocating for that somebody's opinion should be elevated above somebody else's because of their race. Now, that's a terrible thing to say. That's a racist principle. And yet that's what's being perpetuated in critical race theory and in our schools.
Well, here's my big take on that, and it has to do with the fact that you want to pick the right tool for the job. So if you go back to the Civil War, the way to fix slavery was big. You needed a big tool like a Civil War. Then in the 60s, you need a civil rights movement, which is another big tool. It's not as big as the Civil War. And now we've made tremendous progress. More progress could be made, but we've made tremendous progress. And now here's the question. Up until recently, I think it was perfectly legitimate to say that, just to use an example, let's say you were a Black American and you would say some things about white people in general. I don't think that was a problem when racism was far more evident and larger than it is today. But once it starts getting into the subtle, academic, a little bit more debatable world of structural, institutional racism, where we're sure it's there, it's hard to spot, it's a different deal. Then suddenly it becomes really into the opinion mode, and then people are starting to say, hey, wait a minute. It used to be okay when you would say, hey, white people are getting all the advantages, but now it's not as 100% true as it used to be. And now, what about this poor white person? Are they going to be thrown under the bus because of a coincidence of DNA? What about that guy? He didn't do anything. He didn't own any slaves. He was just born poor, and he's trying to make the best of it. So I think there's this awkward period in time where there's still some racism that exists, but the best strategy, and here this is a tough sell, the best strategy if you were Black is to pretend it didn't, but instead they're going the other direction and pretending it's massive. And I think strategically it's moving them in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and it's and this gets to your tweet about protests and how AI furthers protests, and AI is an offshoot of a general narrative that's being perpetuated. And the first question we have to ask ourselves is the narrative true? Not whether racism exists. Of course it does. And you'd have a tough time convincing me that at one point in time it won't. I think it always will to some extent, and we should always be against it. We always are. But the question is, does it exist systemically? Is it embedded in these institutions? And if so, there's a logical explanation for how it would manifest and how we should be able to observe it. And of course, that's where these protests kind of fall off a cliff here, because there is no presentation of an actual concrete evidence-based structure that we can all link arms and fight against together. And this is the real problem. And so, and again, going back to your book, in the logical fallacies that develop, how does this happen? I mean, how do these narratives get spun and people just, will believe them full throttle to the point that we're burning cities down, and in favor of these narratives?
Well, I'm going to tell you something I've never said publicly before. Early on, a few years ago, I tried to work with a member of Black Lives Matter, one of the leadership. And I thought, hey, I'll bet you there are plenty of white people who would love to help, especially with the police, the accusations about the police. I thought there must be, 15 things that we could think of that we could at least test, try. Maybe it's training, maybe it's the way people respond to the police. Let's get a list. Let's see if we can agree. Let's just try a bunch of stuff and see which ones work. And I thought that was a productive thing to do. I soon learned that there was no real interest in solutions. And I know that sounds like a partisan thing to say, but you'd have to be in the room to understand it, that there just wasn't any interest. There was more interest in the protest and the energy it would create, and there was some suggestion that maybe some of the leaders, not the one I was dealing with, but that some of the Black Lives leaders were in it for money, power, and that their incentives were a little different than the people who just wanted a better world. And I think we'd all agree, 90 whatever percent of the protesters literally just want a better world. And they're just saying, hey, can we have a better world here? So I like those people. I agree with them. But they're not on the same side as their own leadership. And I don't think they realize that. Yeah,
no, I think that's absolutely true. And the question I always ask too is, doesn't a protest movement have to have a standard by which they would stop protesting? What would make, you know what I mean? Like, what's the goal? And if there is no goal, if it's protest for the sake of protest, then we're left helpless. And it feels a little bit more like a hostage situation where it's really about power. And I've said this over and over again. Like I dive into the notion of this slogan, no justice, no peace. What does that really mean? And first you have to understand that they redefine justice. Justice is not it's not defined in the classical sense, meaning are somebody's rights being infringed upon, right? That would be an injustice, your life, liberty, or property being infringed upon, or a lack of due process, equality under the law. That would be an injustice. And when that injustice occurs, we should rightfully protest against it. So protesting for George Floyd seems to me like a valid, exclamation of anger, right? Because there was a clear injustice perpetuated against this man.
Well, but here's the thing that tells you AI is driving this and not people. On day one, let's say you're a generic white person and you saw the George Floyd video. The moment you saw that, and I think this is one case where I can speak for just about everybody. Usually you can't do that. I think we all looked at that and said some version of this. Oh, now I get it. Now I get it. If that's what you're talking about, and there's more of that, and you are credibly saying there is more of that, I am so on your side. So that was the point where the conversation should have been over. And at that point, the conversation should have said, all right, we're all on the same side. Give us a list. Let's try some stuff. But that's missing. And the fact that any attempt at solutions is missing, and also there's no thought of, like you said, any kind of an endpoint, that tells you it's being driven by something that isn't people, or that the leaders have a different incentive than the people protesting.
Well, it's driven by power, and again, so justice basically means power. It is the point I'm getting at. Justice can mean justice; it should mean justice, but we all agree that the Derek Chauvin should be held to justice, and he is. And then the next question is this systemically happening across the country? And the data would suggest that it does not, but it doesn't matter for the narrative. And so they redefine justice as power. And what's really become true with Antifa and BLM is that it's if you don't give us power, we won't give you peace. And this is a really concerning thing, especially as we head into the election.
Yeah, and you also have the complication that there are lots of people with lots of different motivations. The people who are breaking stuff and looting and just setting things on fire. Some of it's probably just it's fun, it's exciting, it's entertaining. Maybe they're mad about things in general. So you got that. Then you've got the Antifa, who are sort of allies with Black Lives Matter. But I don't think Black Lives Matter has thought this through, because the magic trick that Antifa does is they say hey, our name says what we are. We're anti-fascist. So if you're against us, you're against fascists. What they don't say, and our media doesn't put them on TV and ask them this question, is it possible to be a capitalist, even a Bernie Sanders capitalist, with some socialism overlay? Can you be a capitalist and not be a fascist? And the answer is, I think, no. So that what Antifa is doing is playing this magic trick where they appear to be after fascists, but they're clearly after the entire system. And if they got what they wanted, civilization would be destroyed. Because if you take capitalism out, we wouldn't even be able to defend the country from foreign invaders.
What do you make of the inability for Democrats to even mention the words Antifa?
Well, I think it's one of those situations where they're allies, but they don't want to admit it. If I had to make an analogy that you'll hate, I would say that the people on the right don't come down hard enough against, racist KKK white supremacists. They do. And, if you talk to Democrats and you corner them, they might say, yeah, we don't like any of the violent stuff. But I think in both cases, people are willing to say that your opinion is still your opinion. It's still America. So whether you're on the left or the right, you're going to let people have their opinion. It's just when it gets into crime and violence that both sides will say, all right, there's the line. You just cross the line.
You're right. Like you said, I might not like the analogy, but so I will counter it and say that we constantly condemn any kind of white supremacist group. I mean, constantly. And in fact, I'll ask any Democrat here on the Hill if they've actually gone toe to toe with the white supremacist anti-Semite movement, and they never have, because I'm the one who actually gets attacked by these guys. So it's there was a couple months where me, Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro were getting lots and lots of heat from this really radical fringe group. And we went toe to toe, all three of us, on all of our events. Because back when we had events, they would come to the events on college campuses. They would try to disrupt them, and I would destroy them publicly. And eventually, they just went by the wayside because it was so unified against them. So I really disagree. I think the right actually, because we have a box of conservatism. It's sort of the nature of having limited principles, where we can emphatically say these are our principles, and you fall outside the box. You fall outside the Overton window. And we condemn you as such. I mean, President Trump is always condemned for not having condemned them enough. But there's like 1,000 quotes of him doing it.
But here's the difference. So I'll just be devil's advocate here for a moment. The difference is that anytime a conservative is asked, they say absolutely the right thing, and they say it immediately. But the people on the left are looking for a little more proactive. You know what? Where's the speech where you just threw it in there because you thought it was right? You know, where's that? That's the dog that's not barking. And I think the left is saying, you know, I feel like you could mention it without us asking once, and that would mean something to us. And that's the same thing that we see with Antifa. If you corner them, of course they're going to say, you know, I don't like, anarchists. But when do they volunteer it?
I don't know if they've ever, but I think when we do corner them, they won't say it. I mean, they still won't say the name. And I'm in, even in private meetings here, I've said this a bunch too, even in private briefings here on terror threats, the Democrats, my Democrat colleagues will deny the existence of Antifa. I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes. So, I mean, it's just, it's like, yeah, I'll go ahead and agree with you that we could always, lean out more against any kind of right-wing violence. The problem is that there are no right-wing supporters out there right now, just burning things down and harassing people and getting in people's faces, committing, political confrontations and all these things.
Let me push back on that a little bit. I think you're right. I think what you said is true, but here's what I'm trying to understand. Pretty much everybody in the left, including the news, says some version of this. The biggest problem in America, violence-wise, is the right-wingers who are violent. And I always say to myself, I'm not really seeing a lot of news about that. But that doesn't mean it's not happening, because our news is unfortunately not that reliable. Have you seen something? I mean, you have a better vision inside the government. Is there a lot of right-wing violence that we're ignoring in the news?
No, I mean, and you know as well as I do, as soon as there's an example of some kind of right-wing violence, the CNNs of the world and the New York Times of the world will blow that up to an insane extent. Here's a good example, right? And this is what I always say. Like, we have the internet. Everything is videotaped these days. So who can make a montage of left-wing violence versus right-wing violence? Now, the Biden campaign, as far as I would imagine, has tons of resources, right? They wouldn't shy away from highlighting right-wing violence. When they made a commercial on this, trying to perpetuate this narrative, the best footage they could come up with was a bunch of trucks with American flags on them, going through Portland when sort of the right, and that's all they were doing. They were just like roving through, and they would honking and being loud and things. But that's the best they could come up with, and I find that to be pretty problematic. Whereas I can do a quick search and have thousands of videos. Right, I've posted them on my social media too. Just not only videos of violence, but montages of political leaders, so Democrat leaders and media leaders. I don't choose fringe people, right? I don't need to quote fringe people on Twitter. I only quote the leadership, telling people to go out and commit these things. And right, Chris Cuomo saying, since when does protesting have to be peaceful, right? So there's so egging it on constantly, and so that would be the objective analysis, right? Like if we present all the evidence at once, which side clearly does it, and it strikes me as odd that many on the left will be like, well, both sides. No, I'm sorry. It's just, that just flies in the face of the facts that we're seeing every single day, across our major cities.
Well, I think you're right, but then are there individual cases where right-wingers are killing people just sort of one-on-one and they're not national news? So I guess I have a blank spot in my understanding, but I'm certainly skeptical that there's any comparable violence on the right compared to the left.
Yeah, I mean, there are no, when Democrats leave an event, they aren't mobbed by our supporters. And you listen to I listened to the podcast with Senator Paul's wife, and listening to her talk about it, and it's scary, because she was saying, like, the video you all saw, that was only the last couple minutes of the confrontation. You should have seen the 10 minutes before that, before the cops showed up to help us. Like, we thought we were going to die. These people were threatening to kill us, and they were so mad. And she said she tried to lock eyes with one at one point, to maybe show some humanity and maybe de-escalate it. And she said that it just made it worse. So this mob mentality breaks through with people, and it's downright scary. And again, you study this, you write books on persuasion. and these sort of logical fallacies. I mean, how do people get wrapped into a mob mentality? Are we more susceptible to it now than we have been in the past? I mean, what's causing 2020 to look like this?
Well, it's probably a number of things. Certainly, we have to figure out who's funding, at least the main troublemakers. I don't think anybody's funding the protesters in general, but there's certainly some core of troublemakers who seem to be able to ship in quickly from other places. They just seem to have some resources. We need to know where that is, because I wouldn't rule out foreign interference. That seems obvious. But it does come back to the AI, because most of what the left believes, their core beliefs, are fake news. The things that literally don't exist, can't be found anywhere, but they are quite convinced that they are true, because if they turn on MSNBC or CNN, it says they're true. And there's a big segment of the population who hasn't caught on to the fact that the news isn't the news anymore. It's not your grandfather's news, that it's full-out propaganda. And they just don't know it. So you're always going to get, there's a rule of thumb with hypnosis, when you're actually working with somebody one-on-one and you're hypnotizing them, that about 20% of the general public can be deeply hypnotized. Everybody else will get some kind of benefits, but they're less able to, let's say, see something that isn't there based on a suggestion, or feel a sensation that's just suggested and not real. So 20% of the left will believe just about anything if there's enough confirmation coming from different sources. So it could be just that you've got people who will believe anything. On top of that, you have this perfect storm of, hey, we have another reason to wear a mask, which is the coronavirus. You put people in masks and they will behave worse. There's just no way around that.
Mm-hmm. Anonymity.
Or at least the feeling of anonymity. So you got that, and you got the people who don't have something else to do, the coronavirus again. They can't go somewhere and be busy in another way. So it's that, then you add the election, then you add that it's Trump, then you add the AI is getting people all worked up in a way that's never been before. Then you add that the organizers are, may or may not be having the best interest in mind. And it's a lot of things that happen by coincidence at the same time. And I've heard somebody say that that's the way of the revolutionaries, is that you get ready and then you wait for the natural opportunity. And apparently it was this.
Yeah. Well, that's a great lead into what I was going to ask you about. There's a 1984 interview. You've probably seen it. It's a KGB agent who defected to the United States. And he's describing the Soviet propaganda machine and, how it takes decades to work, but it works quite well. And he said the first phase is what I remember the most. The second, third, and fourth phases are more opportunistic phases, as you talk about, revolutionaries sort of waiting for the right moment. But the first phase is pretty scary. He calls it demoralization phase. And it's basically a teaching a liberal democracy to hate itself. And this isn't hard to do in a free country where information can be promulgated rather rapidly and freely, and also in a country like ours where we have a history of injustices. It's easy to make you hate that country, and it was even easier at the time because of the Vietnam War, when the Soviets were really perpetuating these things. And what he says is, once people are under the spell, they can't be changed. Their minds cannot be changed. You can show them 2 + 2 = 4. They won't believe you. You can show them that black is black and white is white. They won't believe you. You can show them that the gulags and the Soviet Union. And he would say this, like, he would show defectors, they would show defectors the gulags, and they just don't believe that this is what communism leads to, or this is what socialism leads to. They're under this spell of complete confirmation bias. And so some of this doesn't really seem new. I guess it's been going on for a while.
Yeah, I don't know if we have any information about how much Russia is currently trying to do that. Do we just assume that they are, and maybe some other countries as well, China, et cetera?
I think what they do is they perpetuate I don't think to the same extent that they did back then, right? That's not the information we necessarily have. I'm not ruling it out, but I think what they do is they clearly interfere, and we all know this, of course, just based on the last few years, whether it's troll farms or setting up fake accounts, but basically perpetuating, the divisiveness and issues that, but those issues are organic to themselves. They're not necessarily created from the outside. It's because they don't need to. I mean, we make them up ourselves, and then of course they're perpetuated by whether it's bots or whatever kind of information campaigns delivered from the outside.
Well, unfortunately, there's no alternative to brainwashing children. When I went to school, I remember an exercise that my sixth grade teacher did, and he had us each come up to the front of the room and write on the whiteboard something we would be willing to die for. Now, because I was smart enough to know what he was looking for, I went up and wrote freedom. He's like, oh, yes, that's exactly right. You should die for freedom. And only when I was an adult and I look back at it, I said to myself, okay, I was in sixth grade. I didn't have critical thinking. I wasn't even close. That was pure brainwashing. But I'm very in favor of it, because if you don't brainwash kids, and let's call it your operating system, if you don't give kids an operating system that says your Constitution, your freedom, your flag are important, and you got to fight for those things, even die for them. If you don't give them that, they can't build on top of it. In other words, you can't add any applications to your operating system if your operating system is broken. And now we're seeing the opposite. Now I don't have direct information, but it's obvious that the operating system has been broken, and it's turned into go hate yourself and destroy the country. And I don't see how we could survive if that's a long-term situation.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The kids are being taught only the counter arguments to the foundations. So there's no foundation being given, and a good education would say, okay, here are the foundations. Freedom is indeed important. Western Enlightenment principles are important. Logic and reason are important. You have to have critical thinking in order to get to your ultimate opinion, and you have to be able to defend that opinion. And here's how you do it. But that's all being thrown out the window in favor of simply the counter arguments by teachers, and it's a severe systemic undermining of basic principles. And so kids are left at the end having no foundation whatsoever, except the foundation that the foundations are wrong. And that's it's pure revolution. And what worries me is there's nothing on the other side of that revolution. It goes back to my question, like, what will make you stop protesting? Because if and again, it's perfectly righteous for people to be angry about George Floyd's killing. Perfectly righteous. The question is, once that man is brought to justice, what are we doing now? And maybe there is another step, but then let's talk about the step that we want to take and then the solution that we want to have. And instead of, but it looks like it's devolved into simply anger and power seeking and narrative building.
Yeah, it's almost certain that the organizers are going to have to be taken off the field for anything really to happen. And I think very much like the way, international terrorism is the biggest deal in the world. And then suddenly you wake up one day and you think, we haven't had much problem with that lately. And the reason is that I assume, and maybe you can give me some details on this, but I assume that what's happening is that our spooky parts of our government who know how to get things done have simply taken care of the terrorist leaders. We just don't hear the details. I imagine the same thing is going to be happening with the Antifa and the Marxist leaders. I think they will get rolled up. And once you take the smartest people out of the game, the third smartest person is not nearly as effective as the first smartest person.
I wish I could be as optimistic. I mean, you're right about how we deal with counterterrorism. The reason we have not had another 9/11 is because we decided that we should take the fight to them. That's my opinion anyway. A lot of people believe in bringing our troops home, and I try to tell them, the reason we have guys like me over there, even in small quantities, it doesn't have to be nation building. People are really sick of nation building. Totally get that. But you do have to take the fight to them to an extent so that they don't have the operational capacity and freedom to deliver another 9/11 attack. The reason I'm not as optimistic about Antifa is because, well, what we talked about earlier, they're simply the militant wing of the Democratic Party at this point. It's why the political wing, the Democrats, cannot say a bad word about them, even when pressed. and I've yet to see and I could be proven wrong. I would love to be proven wrong on this. I'd love to see some of my colleagues have statements out there that Antifa is, wrong in every single way, should be condemned, has no right, to exist, all of this. But I haven't yet to see that. When they have been pressed, they say it's a myth. So
but they have the ability to act like it doesn't exist because the news refuses to put any Antifa leaders or anybody who would just speak for them on TV.
And the other hard part about Antifa in particular is there. I don't even know who a leader would be. Like who would be the leader of Antifa? I mean, it's the genius of their organization is how, for lack of a better term, grassroots it really is. There's websites you can go to and see some of the tactics that they share, but I couldn't name one leader. Whereas at least with Black Lives Matter, there's a website. Right. There's more of an organization there. Antifa is more difficult, isn't it?
Well, Antifa does have organization, meaning isn't there the Rose City, whatever it is? There's some known organization. Must be a number of them. So there are people who at least have enough leadership role that they're organizing. And I would say that anybody who had an organizing role, or even anybody who just went to every protest and held up an Antifa sign, it doesn't matter that who they are. I just want to hear them explain how they would be okay with even capitalism of any kind. See if they even understand their own philosophy.
No, they're very parasitic in the sense that they love living off of the fruits of capitalism while advocating for its destruction. I mean, it's difficult to nail down their ideology. It's sort of like anarchy with fascism with communism all wrapped into one, which seems like a contradiction, but it's really not, because you have to produce anarchy and chaos in order to justify your revolution of communism. And you have to use fascist tactics, which they do, which is the whole irony of being the Antifa movement. They use the fascist tactics to implement that anarchy.
Well, I always wonder if there's some deeper thing going on. You're probably familiar that alcoholics have this weird commonality, which they will try to ruin the lives of the people who are closest to them. It's the most consistent thing an alcoholic will do. And if you see the Antifa people, they seem like people who've got their own problems, but need to extend that to the rest of us. It feels exactly like an alcoholic who's simply bringing the pain to other people, and there's not a reason for it. The alcoholic doesn't need to bring pain to all the people close to them. It's just, for whatever reason, they're all wired that way.
Yeah, that could be it as well. Okay, shifting topics for a little bit. And again, I want to bring it back to your book, Loserthink. On the coronavirus response, I mean, how have you? What do you think we've done wrong? And if you were writing your book in 2020, what examples would you be using to make your case?
So here's where the skill stack matters. So as I mentioned, I've got a degree in economics and I've got an MBA. And for years in my corporate job, I would do financial analysis. And in those skills, you learn how to properly compare things. So when the coronavirus thing first kicked off, and I saw that all the national leaders would be, doing their best to protect their countries, I said loudly and publicly and often at the beginning, in a few months, you're going to say that you know who did a good job and who didn't, and you won't. You will be 100% wrong, and here's why. In the beginning, everybody's guessing. Somebody's going to guess right. They're not the smart ones. They're the ones who guessed right. Secondly, there will be so many variables that you'll never be able to compare an apple to an apple. Give you a current example. I was reading about why South Korea did so well in testing, and all the smart people in the news are saying, hey, why didn't we do that if South Korea can do it? And then you dig down just a little bit, and you found out that there was one private company in South Korea who saw this early and said, I think we can make money, and cranked up independently of the government. They cranked up to deal with it, and then they got on top of it early. That was a private company doing something. That wasn't the leader. Right. And you could go right down the line. And I'm critical of the president's communication on this. Yeah. But I don't believe there's a case where he did what the experts didn't tell him. This is another gigantic failure of the of the news business. The question of whether he did a good or bad job should boil down to, did he follow the expert advice when it was given? In other words, was it timely? And I've not heard an example where that didn't happen. And if all of the leaders were following all of their experts, some of the experts were right, some of them were wrong. Nobody is doubting that Birx and Fauci had the right qualifications as well as the right motivations to do what's good for the country. So if the president listened to them and got a worse result than some other country, let's say Germany or whatever, the first question I'd ask is, okay, when you did that comparison, obviously you normalized for obesity, right? Because our obesity level is much higher than Germany. Oh, you didn't. Okay. Well, if you did, there would be a much closer difference in the death rate. And then I'd say, but of course you've also normalized the numbers for the number of Black citizens, because we have a relatively high Black population and they have more comorbidities and more issues compared to Germany, let's say. And they'll say, no, we didn't do that. They'll say, what about your vitamin D? What about your different therapies? What about the size of your country? What about how their experts dealt with it versus ours? We still don't know if hydroxychloroquine makes a difference. So they're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of, and then today we learned that there's a big genetic component, or at least it's strongly suggested. And even things like blood type differ by country. So some countries have more type O blood, and that apparently gives you a little bit of protection compared to other stuff. So on day one, I could see this developing, that we would be exactly where we are now, where the people on the left would say, it's botched, everything's wrong. The people on the right would say, no, everything's right, it's brilliant. And neither of them would know what the hell they're talking about. Because if you don't do this work, as I have, you can't see these things. It's invisible to the casual observer. And I knew that would be the case, and here we are.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. That success, even the definition of success, is entirely objective or subjective when you're dealing with such a complex issue. And because you could say, yes, we have, say, more per capita deaths than Germany. Now, if you remove New York from that equation, we're much closer to Germany, for instance. But the point being, there's a lot of other normal factors that you have to, as you put it, normalize for, right. and also there's other factors to take into account. Whose GDP dropped the most, because GDP can be related to deaths as well. I mean, there's a plenty of economic literature on that, and as far as that goes, I think our country's done the best amongst most Western countries. I heard that statistic before, so I believe it's correct.
Yeah, but here, let me be the devil's advocate again. I don't know that we can tell who's doing better or who.
Well, that's my point. But that's my point. There's so many factors, and you could argue about it basically incessantly.
But even economically, we could look at our GDP and say, oh, we got a little better GDP than the other people, but it's still halftime. People get mad at me when I compare it to a game. It's deadly serious, but we're only halfway through it. We might know in 3 years, we might be able to look back and say, wow, the United States really did come out of that, and they had 3 strong years after it, and these other countries did a little less good. But we don't know now. The economic question, I would say, is completely opaque. We don't have transparency on that.
Yeah, it did. Well, on a more hopeful note, it does seem we are recovering more rapidly than we thought we would, at least a few months ago, where I'd say most economists were predicting 20% unemployment. And it's just as far as the GDP drop, we've had the best performance than say other countries, which is good news. But like you said, let's of course, the long term is what matters.
Yeah, one of the things I like to say about President Trump, this is my new way of understanding him lately, is that, in my opinion, he's bad at easy stuff. Right? Yeah. The president, you can love the president. You could think he's, and I do. I think even the first 4 years are the most impressive presidential performance I've ever seen. But he does bad on the easy stuff.
Can't just right?
Yeah. But here's what he does that, and the reason I originally supported him, his persuasion ability is, his just whole everything about him. He can do the impossible. and he does it routinely. I mean, you just look at the news. He's signing peace deals with Israel. He's moved the embassy. He killed Soleimani. He brought, unemployment down to a level that people didn't even think was a thing. They would have said, no, you can't actually get that low. And then he did it. And I could probably give you 20 examples of things he did with a sweep of a pen or a decision that didn't look possible. They just didn't look possible. Now he's literally decoupling from China after doing what I would say was exactly the right thing, which was push them hard for trade to find out if there was a way to make that work. And I think he pushed as hard as you can do. He found out, he proved it to the world that it won't work. And now he's embarking on what will be probably the most important economic change in this country since, I don't know, the Industrial Revolution or something, pulling back our manufacturing and becoming more, less vulnerable to other countries. So if you look at the impossibles that he's doing, he's racking up like an impossible per week.
Yeah, and there's a boldness factor, I think, to it, which I would argue probably is the driver of that success. Whereas a lot of people would become president, they hear all these counter arguments. Well, this is why you can't take on China too hard, and I think a lot of politicians sort of concede those points and try to take a more moderate approach. And the president's like, no, I said I was going to do this, so we're just going to do it. And so there's a boldness factor. But I want to get back to, I wanted to ask you about coronavirus again, because you mentioned you're an economist. And as an economist, you're trained to take in all these different factors, to normalize for different factors, et cetera. You see plenty of other economists not doing that, and especially the ones that will be interviewed by CNN and the New York Times and tweet a lot, and they will deliberately oversimplify the data to get to an end. And my question is always: do they know what they're doing? Do they know that they're being dishonest and decontextualizing the data, or do they really believe what they're saying? Do they believe they're doing some good with this?
The short answer is I don't know. It's a mystery to me too. I'll tell you that on Twitter, when I get the crazy responses, I've been doing #artist, because I'll just be pointing out that they've never learned how to do critical thinking. But when you see people who are professional economists saying things that look just like crazy or clearly intentionally misleading, you can't tell, because they might actually just be the hypnotized, the brainwashed people. They could just be partisans. They might just be saying, well, I know I'm shading the truth. So it's one of those things. But whatever it is, it's not good, and I don't think you're seeing, too many people from the right doing a complete analysis. It's just not something that's done. And of course, you've got the limitations of it's a 6-minute TV hit. So what can you do?
Yeah. I always grant a little bit of grace for the short TV hits, but I mean, in general, though, it's the massive amounts of misinformation and the obsession with only certain data points too, which is why, as cases were spiking in Texas, every day we tried to put out all of the data, right? So not just total deaths, but per capita deaths, and how do these compare to other states? Like let's look at the entire situation. Let's also look at unemployment. Let's look at the studies that compare, say, universal shelter-in-place orders with more targeted approaches. Say, like in Texas, we just shut down bars, we shut down events, but even as we spiked, our economy remained open. And as it turns out, the trends end up being the same. And I wonder if America will be able to look back with all the data in hindsight. I mean, some of us have been advocating this point for a long time, but hopefully we could all collectively look at it holistically and look back and say, look, these universal lockdowns were an overreach that provided very little benefit with massive amounts of cost, which from an economist perspective or analytical perspective, you don't generally want to do something that has very little benefit with enormous costs.
Well, I'm going to say that as long as we could do things that were reversible, and we didn't know what was the right answer, and there might have been a catastrophic loss of death if we hadn't been aggressive, I would say from a risk management perspective, overdoing the close downs in the beginning was smart. But here's the part that I hoped would happen that hasn't happened, that we would learn something.
Yeah. Well, that's my point. I can give a lot of grace for the beginning few weeks, right? I think that's perfectly reasonable. Yeah.
But at this point, I'm seeing intelligent, educated, well-informed people who can't agree whether masks work at all, like even a little, and whether even closing anything made any difference at all. And I think to myself, I'm not the expert on this, and the fact that there are people on both sides is very bothersome. But why don't we know this? Is that really not discoverable in a way that we can just all agree on? Do masks work? The most simple, studyable thing, you would think.
Yeah, you would think. I mean, I sort of stay away from the mask conversation because it doesn't really cost us anything to wear masks, so I don't mind it as much. But I do see I do see the conflicting data and the conflicting studies on that. I just
But I would say that the conflicting studies are usually a magic trick, because what you'll see is somebody will do a laboratory study. Will they say, "Well, see, you can see that the air is coming out of the side of the mask," and then I'll say, "Okay, but what about the real world? Because if my air is coming out of 5 sides of my mask instead of coming out of my mouth like a cannon, am I not spreading less disease further away from my body if if the mask is just sort of keeping my exhalations close to me? Otherwise, would I be like a cannon fire just taking out people across the room? I
Right,
don't know.
right.
I don't know.
I tend to agree with that. Yeah,
But
that's what I tell people. It's like it just prevents you from spitting on somebody when you're talking to them, which in theory should mitigate the risk of spread. So
right.
that's why I've always been like, hey, let's all wear masks if we think that works. We when my campaign actually delivered like 50,000 masks early on before masks were widely available. So I've always been okay with that. But the universal lockdowns, I think we do have plenty of data and studies that especially coming out of Europe. For some reason, we're not doing them here as much, but we can look at, say, places that have large populated areas that have spiked at the same time. Let's look at California and Texas. Huge difference in lockdown policy, and yet the trends and data as far as coronavirus is concerned are pretty much the same. So it kind of lends credence to this idea that it seems to the virus burns through the way the virus will burn through despite the lockdowns. And so you have massive costs in California with little added benefit.
So, I'll tell you a couple of the mind-blowing things that I learned early on was some epidemiologist, I forget who it was, but one of the top ones in the world, said that we don't know why any virus stops. And I thought, okay, I must have heard that wrong.
Yeah.
Because surely we know why a virus stops. I mean, we couldn't get this far without knowing why a virus stops. But I've never seen a counter to that. I believe we actually don't know why the common virus stops. And it's not because of herd immunity, and it's not because of vaccinations. We just don't know. And so when the president said, and I think obviously I wish he hadn't, but he said, it's just going to disappear. He is right. He just
Eventually.
Yeah. He didn't have the timing right, but he's right.
Yeah. No, I mean, he speaks in absolutisms, which is, what you were getting at before with some of his messaging on it. But, and going back to the, what was the right way to handle it. And again, I just agree that I think it's absolutely right. There's almost no way to know. And if you're going to criticize somebody, you have to criticize them logically. And you got to this point where, Joe Biden will constantly criticize the president. And this is what he'll do. He'll often lay out things that the administration has done. I would have increased testing. There was a magic button that said increase testing, and President Trump just refused to press it. And of course, that's nonsense. And it only takes a couple seconds of critical thought to come to that conclusion. But the media perpetuates this narrative so much that people just don't understand it. And if you're going to properly criticize somebody's actions, you have to be able to point to a fork in the road. And say, hey, you went left and I told you to go right. We all said go right at the time. Given what we knew at the time, we said you should do this, but you refused. That would be a proper criticism. But they can't do that because it never happened. And what's even more frustrating is that, well, it actually did happen, except the other side wanted to take the wrong route. And I'm referring to January 31st, banning travel from China.
Right.
It is very clear that if Joe Biden was president, he would not have done that. Very clear, because he said so at the time.
Right.
So we know this objectively based on his own actions at the time, not months later, no hindsight here, but at the time, that this virus would have hit us on the West Coast a lot faster. That is a fact. And I wish.
But let me give you a little devil's advocate on that.
Okay.
If Joe Biden had been president, he also would have had a Fauci and a Birx telling him,
Perhaps,
maybe a different story than a candidate learns. So I think any of these comparisons are false.
Well, then but then he should have kept his mouth shut at the time,
right.
And said, maybe President Trump is getting some information that I don't have. That would have been a smart thing to do, but he didn't. I mean, he said what he said. So,
right. Yeah, I'm not going to give him a pass on that. But every now and then you'll see a candidate say what I always appreciate. They'll say, well, I wouldn't have handled that international event that way, but I have to admit the president gets information I don't have. Like I always feel like, okay, I can live with that.
Yeah, that's a fair answer. That's a nuanced answer, but unfortunately, we fail to live in the era of nuance these days, which is why I appreciate talking to you, because I mean, I think there are rules to rational thought, right? There's rules of logic, and it does seem to me that in the year 2020, we're just not abiding by the rules of logic. To the extent that a modern civilization based on Western Enlightenment values should be adhering to.
I wonder if things are worse or it's just more obvious because, just the way social media and the way the news and everything works. I don't know that we're any dumber, although there's one theory that says that when the pyramids were built, we must have been smarter because we couldn't figure out how to do it today if we had those tools.
Yeah.
So maybe we were smarter. Who knows?
Well, honestly, is there an incentive not to know things? Because is this a pattern in human history? I wonder whereas things are just delivered to us because of the wonders of capitalism that we no longer have the incentive to better ourselves and to compete in our environment in a more rational and I guess competitive way. Is that part of it?
Well, I just think we're not wired to be rational creatures, and you can't change your basic wiring. And I think that rationality is often an illusion. If you think about all the decisions that you will make today outside of science, none of them are backed by science. Pretty much nothing you're going to do today. Did you see a randomized control study that says that would be a good idea? You just kind of looked at it and said, well, based on what I know and patterns I've seen before and a little risk management, this makes sense to me. So suddenly you take that universal process where people are just sort of making their best guess all the time, and you put it into science, and unless they are scientists or have studied how to adapt, they just take the same form of thinking into science and say, well, okay, science said it's getting warmer. I guess it's getting warmer.
Yeah, it also gets to the people screaming, "Listen to the science." It's not as if science delivers a perfect public policy solution. That's not the point of science. Science is inherently discovery, and at a certain point, you have to make judgments based on trade-offs.
Yeah, and the thing that nobody ever knows, given that we all agree that science is about crawling toward the truth over time. You don't say, there's the truth. I mean, sometimes you do.
Yeah.
But you never know. There'd be no way to know if you're halfway to the truth or all the way there.
And the falsifiability of a claim, I think, is so important, and it's a little confusing to people, but it's an important logical fallacy that I think is being made constantly in these debates and in the subjects that we've been talking about. So if you're on one side, if you're, and I hate making this partisan, but it does seem that Democrats and Republicans just happen to fall on different sides of the coronavirus analysis. And so, any number of increased deaths automatically means a failure to a Democrat. Now, that's a non-falsifiable claim because there's just I'm like, well, what if it was this? What if it was this? They would always be right, right? And if the person's claim, if they can always claim to always be right, no matter what the end result is, there's a problem with their logic. And I think the same thing happens with these protests. It's like we can show you data point after data point that says, this narrative isn't what you're saying it is, but they claim it's not falsifiable because there's always something, and maybe you can't see it, and maybe you don't know that you're a racist, maybe you don't know how what your bias is, and maybe it's secret. This gets to the essence of the number one seller, white fragility. It's non-falsifiable, so you can never argue with them, and this is deliberate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that anybody is trying to find the right answer. I mean, I think it's just team play for the most part. The people who get on TV, the people who get to be pundits, people become politicians. They've taken a side, and it's not reasonable to assume that they would leave that aside. But take an example you used earlier. If somebody said, I would have taken a different path than the president did early in the coronavirus, and therefore, my path would have been better than whatever he did. That's actually nonsense, because the only comparison that could be made that would be rational is impossible, which is comparing the exact situation with a President Trump who made this decision versus the exact situation with a President Trump who made the other decision. And we don't have that. There's no comparison. You only know what he did, not how the other one would have worked out better or worse. That's unknowable.
It really is. And I would have hoped that that coronavirus in general would not have become so partisan. It was foolish of me to hope that in an election year, but maybe it would have happened in any other year also. But it did. It became highly opportunistic, and we're worse off for it. I also made the absurd claim months ago that come fall, that students, after living with with the real virus, a real global pandemic, would stop being offended at the little things, would stop obsessing over microaggressions. I could not have been more wrong. I could not have. It's somehow it made things worse.
One of the hypnosis tricks for dealing with things that are, let's say, resistant to logic is that you use illogic instead of logic. And sometimes that could work. For example, right now, I suggested that we should replace Confederate statues, and anybody who was a slave owner, replace them with statues of citizens who had criminal records and had died in police encounters. Now, when you say that, you say, well, that's ridiculous. But it is what's being asked, in a sense. We are making heroes out of I'm going to say the wrong people. If you make a hero out of somebody who resists arrest, you're going to get more of it, and you don't want that. Yeah. So if you simply agree with the other side and amplify it, this is sort of a clever hypnosis trick, you can get the person to talk themselves out of it. And sometimes that'll work. But you can't just change somebody's mind with your good arguments.
Yeah, and that's been one of the more difficult things and lessons that I've had in politics. Realizing that for many there's no amount of argumentation that will be persuasive, and because once we wire ourselves a certain way, we're a little bit stuck. Oftentimes, I speak at high schools a lot. Well, I used to, and they'll ask how they can get involved in politics, and I always started out with, listen, I hope you end up on my side, but I would strongly encourage you to take pride in not taking a side for a while. You simply don't have the experience and knowledge base to really understand your own arguments at this point. And once you're attached to a side, it's devastating psychologically to be told you're wrong. And I don't wish that upon you, because it hurts. And so it's better just to come to your conclusions over time and really know why you think something. I'm not even asking for your mind to be changed, but I do ask that people have a rational set of explanations and evidence for why they might believe something, and or at least be able to explain how your values differ from mine, as to why we disagree on a policy, because in the end, our values do disagree. I think Thomas Sowell's book, Conflict of Visions, probably explains this the best, the unconstrained vision and the constrained vision. People are dramatically wired differently, and how they view the world. And that matters. And that should be part of your explanation for why you might refuse to change your mind over something.
Yeah, and there's some science about conservatives have actually some natural difference. There's something about their brains are wired a little differently. And until you understand that, you're going to be kind of confused.
That's exactly right. We're about out of time. Scott, thank you as always for being on. We should do this more often. It's just fun to talk over events and current events with you. And appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.